and an unashamed populism cost Greene the Nobel Prize for Literature.
This arbiter of the universe is all very well, but you've first of all got to be an entertainer and get people listening to you. And he was very much an entertainer, there's no question of doubt about it. He could tell a good story, as well as casting his own peculiarly cold light on people's motives and their own attitudes.
The fourth of 6 children, Greene's otherwise happy childhood was scarred by his years as a pupil at the boarding school where his father was headmaster. Depressed and bored by Berkhamsted, he used to dice with death playing Russian roulette. At 16, he was sent away for psychoanalysis. It was a crisis he thought he ended with conversion to Catholicism and marriage in his early 20s, but religious and self-doubt was to dominate his writing.
Well, I've been described as a novelist of faith, and he's been described as a novelist of doubt, and I think that's the difference between us. He was, in fact, rather ahead of the Vatican Council. You know, after the Vatican Council, things loosened up amongst Catholics, and he, in a sense, was a precursor of that. He had a very liberal and rather individualistic interpretation, particularly of the Church's moral teaching, at a time when the Catholic teaching was rather rigid. So, in a sense, he was ahead of his time.
Greene's first novel, published in 1929, won him a contract for 3 more. He went on to produce more than 50 works and became one of the most widely translated authors. And the most widely adapted for film. His books attracted great directors, and the films brought Greene a greater popularity.
Although the books conjure up atmosphere and conjure up characterization, and indeed will examine a particular psychiatric point or philosophical point or whatever, the actual storyline is very tight indeed.
Apart from the film adaptations in which he was involved, like Brighton Rock and The Third Man, Greene was largely contemptuous of the movie versions of his work, considering them betrayals, and he himself was wary of the camera.
No, it's impossible. I'm sorry, it's impossible. I've been speaking
Apart
for
from
a
this
whole
appearance
hour.
in a François Truffaut film in 1973, Greene fought hard for his privacy, living a reclusive existence in the south of France.
He guarded his anonymity, I think rightly, because, you know, once a writer becomes a sort of famous face, then you lose that kind of anonymity which a writer needs in order to sort of mix with ordinary people and observe people. We think of him always as being rather famous. He wasn't actually that successful until he was in his 40s. He struggled quite hard.
Only his controversial politics could lure Greene in front of the camera. For example, here in 1987, he's seen receiving an award from the Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega for supporting the Sandinista revolution. With his left-wing opinions and challenging approach to Catholicism, Greene certainly knew how to annoy the establishment. His politics and writing divided the literary world.
As a writer, he was considerable, but I hate to say this now at the moment of his death, he was not great. I think he was aware of that. He tried to follow the great Edwardian writers such as Joseph Conrad and Ford Madox Ford, but I think he realized that he had chosen a rather more popular medium than they would have chosen.
I just said, as far as one can see, he's the last of the great literary giants. Nobody would ever dispute that he was a giant. And I don't think there's anybody even beginning to take his place. He was never awarded the Nobel Prize as a result of the sort of spiteful vindictiveness of some obscure Swedish professor or other. I don't know the full story. But nobody, I don't think there's a person with anything to do with books at all would deny the fact that he was a giant, that he's will remain a gigantic figure in the history of the English novel.
Greene always insisted he had no regrets about missing out on the Nobel Prize. And in his final years, he seemed at last to have found a certain internal peace.
So if one's going to be afraid of death, at 78, one would be afraid every night when one went to sleep, wouldn't one? I mean, if one didn't wake up. I don't think, when you're old, there's no reason to fear death.
Graham Greene, who died today. And there'll be a special tribute to Graham Greene, led by Harold Pinter, on Channel 4 at 9:45 this Sunday, followed by the film of his novel, Brighton Rock. Tonight's headlines: Michael Heseltine, the Environment Secretary, has announced he's capping the charges of 14 local authorities, 3 of them Conservative-run. The UN Security Council is meeting to settle the final details of the ceasefire terms to be imposed on Iraq following its defeat in the Gulf War. Turkey has closed its border to prevent huge numbers of Kurdish refugees crossing to get away from Saddam Hussein's advancing forces. Some reports say more than 2 million Kurds are trying to flee Iraq. This evening, a statement by the Iraqi leadership said it had put down the insurrection in the north.